For those of you who have been to a previous FIT educational conference, you'll recognize these two faces here. We're super excited that they're back again this year, and we hope to have them forever and ever, obviously. So this is Chris and Robert. They're both from the Gray Robinson Law Firm, and they handle all of the lobbying efforts for FIT. And they always have a great presentation. We're excited to see every year, and whatever the new theme is. So good luck.
Thank you. And I feel somewhat compelled to correct the record. I got a promotion on the screen there. I'm an Esquire now. I'm actually not. I'm way worse than a lawyer. I'm just a lobbyist. So I appreciate the Esquire, but not right now, not yet at least.
My wife would remind that I'm only an Esquire name these days. Okay. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back. Thank you for having us. I'm glad we're doing this stuff in person again. It's awesome. And for those who are watching on the recorded, we're glad to see you all as well, virtually, so to speak. I am sad I didn't get the invite to the 1920s party tonight, but I am already picturing some of y'all's outfits, and they look amazing. So, all right. Robert and I are going to do a little bit of an update of last session and then talk about what's coming this session. But what we always feel is a helpful way to, am I doing this right? Oh, already off to a false start. No, you're fine. But what we found is helpful is to talk about the players in the process, right? Whether it's the governor, the speaker, some of the legislators, and help you understand who they are. And so when we talk about some of these decisions made, you can understand some of the politics and context of those decisions. So I'm going to try that again. Are we good now, or?
And I'll just point out, we think it's important to do this for y'all because in an age of term limits, if you're not following this stuff on a daily basis the way we are, the turnover in Tallahassee is immense every single cycle. So this past legislative year, following the 2020 elections, there was 50 new members of the House and Senate out of 160 members. After 2022, there'll be another at least 40 that are going to cycle in, new people that have never served in any capacity, or they might be House members matriculating their way to the Senate. But the turnover up there is constant thanks to term limits. So we like to make sure we're keeping you guys abreast of kind of who the players are right now and who to be watching in the future.
Not working yet, but so are we good, or should I? Okay, there we go. That's us. Good thing I didn't wear the same suit today. That's good. All right, so you know who we are, and we'll go to the next slide here if I can get it to go. So this year we thought it would be helpful to, all right, there we go. Use Ted Lasso. Hopefully you've seen this show. If not, we'll do our best to explain some of these characters in there to help give you an idea of who we're talking about.
And I am 2 episodes behind, so if you knock any spoilers out here, we're going to have issues.
It's going to be awkward. So if you're not familiar, this is a fake team in the English Premier League in England, obviously, and they are all these fictitious characters. It's a fun show. Please watch it when you can. So we start with Governor Ron Desantis. So right, he is the head honcho. He is the one who is essentially running the show, especially during a pandemic, right, when we're under emergency rule order. You really do have a governor who it all starts and stops there. So for us, if you've seen the show, we think the best person to present that is the owner, Rebecca Welton, the owner of the team, Richmond. She's in charge of everything. She makes all the decisions. She obviously takes a lot of input. She works with her players and everything. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with the owner, and in our case in Florida, the governor. Let me assure you, every piece of legislation that we talk about, including the ones that were vetoed, were completely vetted by this governor and his team. There is not a single piece of legislation that they don't check on, go and vet on, and give their blessing or not. And even after they give their blessing, as you'll see sometimes, they still veto it because they get pressure from the outside. So it's good to be the governor, just like it's good to be the owner of an English Premier League soccer team.
So the other 2 most important players in any legislative session is the House Speaker and the Senate President. Next to the governor, they are, without question, the most powerful folks in the room, and they're in charge of both what legislation makes it to the floor of their chamber, as well as making sure the trains run on time and keeping everything up to speed as they go through a session. So for them, we viewed them as Roy Kent. So I can't promise that they have the same profanity use as Roy Kent, although we've been in situations where one of them does. But they're at the tail end of their legislative career. So if you watch the show, you know that Roy is at the end of his career on the pitch, but he's working on what might come next in his career. And so we know for Wilton Simpson, the Senate president, he's running for agriculture commissioner, so he's now running statewide to replace, it'll be replacing Nikki Fried, who's running for governor, but he'll likely be our next agriculture commissioner. Chris Sprouse, we don't know what he's going to do next, but he's going to do something. That could be in the higher education space. It could be running for local office. It could be running for something statewide. We don't really know yet. We just know he's raising money because we get those phone calls. But they're all looking for kind of what's next in their career, and so we thought Roy was a good comparison for them.
So Speaker and President Designate, there's a lot of folks, that's the leadership team for both the House and Senate, but I'll point out on the top row on the left, that left mark is Paul Renner. He's the Speaker Designate in the House. He's based out of Northeast Florida, kind of the Palm Coast area. And then on the top right there on that row, that's Kathleen Pasadomos. She's the President Designate out of the Naples area. So for the Speaker and President Designate, these are the folks who are next, right? They're soon to be in charge. They've shown that they've got this ability, and their folks have trusted them with this power to say, when it's time, you're going to be the one in charge. So for us, if you watch Ted Lasso, we think the best comparison is Coach Nathan. Now, if you've watched all of season 2, please forgive that reference, but I'll leave it at that. But generally speaking, Coach Nathan was sort of on his way up, and then the coaches and the players say, you clearly know what you're doing when it comes to coaching. We're going to continue to elevate you up the ladder. And that's kind of what it is with your designates, both president and speaker. Now, interesting, we're going into an election year, 2022, with this session. They say that the highest point of their power, these president and speakers, is when that year before they take over. Because, and why maybe you may be asking is, both Kathleen and Paul, when they're coming into this session, everyone who's returning, and as Robert said, there's a lot of turnover, but there's a lot of folks coming back, they're starting to look to them for guidance on how to vote on things and where to go, because they're going to be the ones deciding who's going to be the budget chair, who's going to be on certain committees, who's going to be this chair of that. And so the current speaker and current president start to lose a little bit of their power, and the incoming start to gain it. And from the lobbyist side, we always, I don't know if we enjoy watching it, but it's certainly interesting theater to watch as you see session go on. And there is a tug of war between the presiding officers and the soon-to-be presiding officers, because the current presiding officers realize their power's slipping away as these folks start to rise up. But they still have the title, right? And they still have the gavel, and they still kind of decide when the trains run on time. So with us, it's Coach Nathan, and we'll come up with some more comparisons. This one's a fun one.
Yeah, so Senator Bean is the president pro tem. He's been in the legislature for, I want to say, 16 years now between his time in the House and the Senate. This, for us, was the easiest one. He's Coach Beard.
There you go.
There it is. And
for the folks at home, 18 years.
Yeah.
There you go.
So for us, this one was the easiest. He's Coach Beard, and really for no other reason than the beard. But we'll move on to the next one. That one was really more of just a fun one. These two are budget chairs. So the current Senate and House Appropriations chairs, Kelly Stargell, who's from Lakeland, and Jay Trumbull, who's from Panama City. You may know them from your home areas. They are, in many ways, particularly towards the end of session, two of the most powerful people in Tallahassee as they're building their budgets. The House and Senate have each passed theirs. They're in budget conference, piecing together what will ultimately be the Appropriations Act that goes to the House and Senate floors and goes to the governor for approval. And they've got significant sway. And so for them, our best guess was Leslie Higgins. So they're doing the dirty work. They're often taking difficult positions, doing the hard stuff that nobody else in the office wants to do or nobody else in the team wants to do. If you've watched this season, you see Higgins working out of closets for offices all the time. A lot of the deals that get done between the appropriations chairs are done in back rooms that you've probably heard about in Tallahassee, getting the work of the budget done. And so we thought they were Higgins.
Okay, Jamie Tart. Who knows who Jamie Tart is? Can we get a raise of hands here? Yeah, so you know this is the prima donna on the team, the person who thinks they're better than everyone else, doesn't want to answer to anyone. And we're here to tell you they exist in the legislative process, but we won't tell you who, because, we like our jobs and we don't want to get in trouble, but they exist. So legislative staff, these are the grinders, these are the workers. Some of them are lifers. They've been there, we heard in the back, 18 years for the legislators. Some of them have been there 30 years and beyond. They've served through various different governors. They've served through the party change in the 90s from the Democrats to the Republicans. They've seen it all. And then there's also short timers. So we thought Danny Rojas and Keely Jones. So if you know Danny Rojas, he's the football player that always says, "I love football," and he's so excited about it. And that's sort of these young staffers that just get really excited about the process and work their tail off. And then you've got the Keely Jones, sort of you don't know who they are, but they are the grease or whatever that gets the machine going during every legislative session. So a lot of times thankless. But without them, none of this process would work. And Robert and I make it a point, as do most of our lobby team, to get to know them as best we can because, frankly, like we said, a lot of them are lifers. And when these legislators term out, they will still be there the next day. Even legislative aides, they move on to other members. And if you've got a great relationship with a staffer, sometimes that's as important, if not more important, than the relationship with the legislator. All right, bloggers.
Yeah, so the bloggers and the Tallahassee news media and the folks that cover the Capitol press corps, this was one of the more easier ones for us too. Trent Krim, the Independent. They are the ones with their eyes always on the process, always on the members, keeping up with what's happening. And for us, on the lobbying side, we really couldn't do our jobs well without a good Capitol press corps, without a good and hardworking bloggers and folks that follow this process, because particularly with the rise of Twitter over the last 8 to 10 years, things are breaking on Twitter and you're finding out information there far quicker than you're ever going to read it in the newspaper or even see it online. And so being able to have folks that are quick to the story, breaking things as they happen, makes us better on behalf of our clients, and I think serves the legislature well in being able to get information out there to the public in a quick way.
And of course, the lobbies. This picture was clearly doctored. I'm not that short, or Robert's not that tall. But
I love that picture. I think it's great.
We're gonna talk to staff about that. For the lobbyists, if you're familiar with the show, most folks think guys at the bar, and believe me, we do go to the bar. But probably, as we like to see it, we're more like Dr. Sharon. We're here to give these members advice and counsel to help shape where this legislation goes, and obviously give our clients advice and counsel to help protect their interests or advocate for their interests up in Tallahassee. But I think probably more likely than not guys at the bar. Taller, though. We're going to talk about that picture. All right. And then there's Ted Lasso, right? If you're familiar with the show, he is the embodiment of everything we hope, right? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, if you're familiar with that movie, and Jimmy Stewart. There are some Ted Lassos in the process, but as we can attest, very rare in the process. There's probably more Jamie Tarts than there are Ted Lassos. But that's kind of the nature of the beast when you come up to Tallahassee, is no matter how well-intentioned when folks get up there, it's a grind, it's a process, it's the sausage making as we talk about. But we're still holding out hope. There's a Ted Lasso coming, and when he shows up, we'll let you know who he is. So with that was our attempt to keep it fun and light. Not quite the same as The Office or Batman. I didn't get to do Batman voices today, but we're going to go jump right in, and Robert, go with it last session.
So we're going to run through the next several slides pretty quickly because, y'all are in many ways students of the process. You have an idea of what happened this past legislative session, but maybe more importantly, it's all about 6-month-old information at this point. So the legislature last met in the spring of this year. The new budget and all laws became effective July 1 or thereabouts, depending on the particular bill. And so a lot of this is going to be a bit dated. You'll know some of this, but then when we get towards the end, we'll talk about what to expect in the coming year and, of course, answer any questions that y'all have got, which is what we love to do. So first, it was a session unlike any other. There was no access to the Capitol in the Senate. There was very limited access to the Capitol in the House. There were very strict protocols about how you got in, how you got out. You had to have the days of roaming the halls of the Capitol all day long were long gone, at least for this coming year. Now, the good news is we're back as they're in committee weeks right now. There's another one next week, and the Capitol is, by most accounts, back to some semblance of normalcy. Even after the Delta wave, we are still in a normalcy kind of status in Tallahassee, but it was one like any other. And what it really did is it changed the way that we, as lobbyists, and you as organizations had to advocate. What was maybe a Tallahassee day at the Capitol or a travel day to the Capitol or maybe a week up there or a few days here and there became everything by telephone, everything by Zoom, everything by text message. And so the way we chose to advocate or had to advocate had to change with the times given the protocols that were in place, and it made for a really interesting year. And then a quick look at the numbers. These are the number of total bills filed, obviously 3,000 bills, and only 275 of those passed, which is an incredibly small number, but that's the most in at least the last 6 years. They have been passing fewer and fewer bills in session. As we look ahead to next year, in an election year, my guess is that number is going to come down in terms of the total bills that are filed, or excuse me, total bills that are passed, for a couple of reasons. One, election years, they tend to do less. And then two, if you look at what happened this past legislative session, particularly with the governor's priorities, the speaker's priorities, and the president, virtually everything they wanted got done. Every priority the governor and of the president and of the speaker got done, with the exception of one, and we'll talk about which one that one is. But there's not really a whole lot left to do other than the obvious one, redistricting, and then just sort of the general legislating that's going to happen in any given year. Of course, there's one thing they have to do, and that's pass a budget.
And that is pass the budget. So we can always count on one thing, even if it takes a special session, is that they will pass a budget. And we talked about those budget writers, Mr. Higgins, if you will, from the show. You know, at the beginning of session last January, if you recall, it was the worst of times, to steal from Charles Dickens. We were year-over-year recession or revenue deficit, if you will. The pandemic hadn't shown any signs of letting up just yet, although vaccines in theory were around the corner and accessible to everyone. And it wasn't clear what the federal government was going to do as far as providing aid to the states and our school districts and everything else. We knew something was coming, but we didn't know what. And then by the time session ended, it was the best of times. Our revenue projections were starting to grow as tourism was starting to pick back up and other things as the vaccines were rolling out. And of course, the feds dropped about $10 billion on the state. We probably would have had more if not for, and give credit where credit's due to the governor and keeping the state open. Our economy was doing a little better than other states. So we, instead of 12 to 13 billion, which was what some folks thought we should get, we only got 10 billion. But by the way, 10 billion is a lot of money, and you can do a lot with that. So let's look at what they did. It was it was a $101.5 billion budget. We'll talk about that. The governor vetoed it to right below 100 billion. 6.7 in the stimulus dollars were spent, but some of those dollars were pulled back in the vetoes. They put $6 billion in reserves for obvious reasons. You never know. 1,000 bonuses for teachers and first responders. Increased the minimum wage for state workers. $1 billion in the emergency funds, which we pointed out was vetoed, which is essentially the same thing, because by vetoing those federal dollars, it just reverts back into federal dollars that they can use next year. So it's kind of, in a sense, emergency funds anyways, just the governor will have to get legislative approval to spend it. And like I said, it was really $1.6 billion in total vetoes. I don't think this governor wanted to be the first $100 billion governor, or at least in his approval, so it's right below 100, and my guess is next year we'll be close to that. Slice it, we love pie around here, so let's look at that. Red is the trust fund. That's a lot of federal dollars or state trust funds, what have you, pretty consistent funds, and that blue is your top line revenue, and $36.3 billion, which really wasn't all that far off from the previous year. As we said, the numbers kept getting better and better as we got closer to session. And then if you look at this, you can see that the green, it was Health and Human Services. Not surprised in a state like ours, we have a lot of folks on Medicaid, we have a lot of senior citizens. So our Health and Human Services is high, and then the orange is education. No surprise there. Between K-12 and higher education, we spend a lot in the state. Probably the notable one, that light blue, transportation, is $13.7 billion. They used some of those federal dollars to backfill last year's road fund. If you recall, during the pandemic, we had the shut down everything to stave off the spread of the stop the spread, right? No cars were on the road, and it stayed that way for a couple months, right? Some people started going back to work, but for a few months, the roads were virtually empty in Florida. Well, as you know, we pay for our roads and our road fund through gas taxes, and if you're not driving your car, you're not buying gas. So the road fund from the previous year was about 25% down. And that was going to put a lot of road projects behind schedule in the state. While they took advantage of the empty roads to get some projects moving, right? If you're living in Central Florida, familiar, the I-4 and 408 interchange was a godsend to get that thing fixed. But generally speaking, they were falling behind. So they took the federal dollars and fully restored what should have been the budget for last year, and then and guaranteed that this year's road fund would be taken care of, even if we had some shortages. Although, as you've seen, people are traveling, spring breaks, summer break, what have you. And the only other thing I would point out there is you've got the ARPA funds right there in the $10 billion, which again, only about half of those ended up being used. And so they'll have about another $5 billion for this coming year budget. All right, and then revenues are a fun topic, and we got some cool stuff to talk about. Is it a casino night tonight?
There is a casino night.
Is Seminole
tonight.
Tribe helping with that? Because they might.
Not yet. I hope not. although it's almost legal. So new tax revenues, there can't be a legislative session, at least not in the last 15 years, without some sort of tax cut package. This one was pretty significantly scaled back from previous years. All those dates have already passed, but there was a back-to-school sales tax holiday. There was a new thing called Freedom Week. If you were buying tents or coolers or outdoor equipment, you were sales tax free in early July over the 4th weekend. Passed the final day of session, and it expands from a policy perspective. It expanded tax credits for affordable housing and some other things, but really it was a scaled-back version of a tax cut package based upon what things we're used to in years past. There was a new tax collections bill passed, and it was lauded by Republicans and Democrats alike until there was some thought of maybe it could be a nice political winning argument for the Democrats. But $1 billion in new revenue will be collected now as a result of the Wayfair bill, which effectively creates the statutory mechanism for collecting taxes on online retailers that don't have a footprint in Florida. So it's tax that you already owed, and I know in this room that prior to this, whenever you bought something from eBay or Wayfair and it didn't automatically charge you sales tax, all of you got your checkbook out, all of you wrote the check for the sales tax, and you all sent it to the Department of Revenue. So it really doesn't apply to y'all, but there are people, shockingly, in this state that didn't do that. And now that they're going to have to do that, or it's going to happen automatically, that's about $1 billion that will be available to the legislature on a going forward basis, recurring in the years ahead. The political points that I mentioned earlier that got scored were Nikki Fried, who, as I mentioned, is running for governor. She's our current agriculture commissioner. She had a little bit of fun right when this bill was passed by saying that the legislature and the governor had just raised your taxes by $1 billion. The Republicans would argue, well, it was a tax that was already owed. It's not really raising of the taxes, it's just collecting it, but those are some of the fun things that happen with bills like this.
One note before we go to the other slide, or you don't have to go back, but part of that is Robert said it's $1 billion. It's a $1.3 billion total. About $300 million of that is actually local and sales tax that would be collected. So some of your local governments are going to get a little bit of a boost from this. But as well, to kind of sell it internally with Republicans, because to Nikki Fried's point, polling-wise, some people view that as a tax increase, even though it's a tax already owed and just people weren't paying it. And so the legislature that they crafted was the first $3 billion of it collected, so probably the next couple of years will go towards replenishing the unemployment fund in the state of Florida, which, as you can imagine, because of the pandemic, was completely depleted. And if they didn't do that, all of y'all's employers and all the other employers across the state that had new hires would have had an increase in what they paid into the unemployment tax. So that's sort of an offset there, which is a big win. And then as well, when that is paid off, when it gets to billion, they will no longer use it to replenish, but then they will take the business rent tax that some of you may pay from 5.5 to 2%. And as you all know, Florida and City of New York are the only places in the country that charge a business rent tax. So if you don't own and you lease your properties where you're at, that's going to be a big win when that tax goes and drops down. So that's how they kind of sold it internally. It wasn't a tax. And I think while Nikki tried, I think it kind of fell flat there.
So another big deal that was cut this year was on the Sadowski Trust Fund. So for years, the legislature has raided this trust fund, which was dedicated for affordable housing, to spend it on other things in the budget. And there has been an effort, at least in the Senate for the last several years, to A, fully fund Sadowski for the purpose that it's for, and B, to make it one of the trust funds that you can't raid. So put it in statute as one of the ones that the legislature is not allowed to touch. That has been a challenge, to say the least, to get that done over the last several years. And while they did fully fund it in 2020, it ultimately got vetoed as the governor was cutting $1 billion to prepare for the pandemic out of the budget in his veto pen. The fully funded Sadowski fund was vetoed. So what happened this year is sort of a grand bargain was pushed and passed by Kathleen Passidomo, the incoming Senate president. And what it does is protect ship and sale, the Sadowski Trust Fund, from ever being raided, but it breaks it up into basically, and those are rough numbers, 50%, 25%, 25%, with 50% going to traditional affordable housing, 25% to septic to sewer, and 25% to sea level rise projects. So on one hand, it's a win for affordable housing and those that care about the Sadowski Fund, because even at 50%, it's more money than we've been getting for those projects. But on the other hand, it's not great because it does divert the funds in other ways. So my guess is over the next couple of years, they're going to watch this, see how it plays out, and then maybe come back and tweak it as needed. But at least for the foreseeable future, this will be the way Sadowski is spent. And then lastly, the most fun of the revenue issues is gaming. The legislature did pass and the governor did sign a new Seminole Gaming Compact that includes, amongst other things, sports gaming in Florida, making that legal. To put it mildly, that's in litigation now on whether or not the legislature overstepped its constitutional authority in passing this, and whether or not the compact might not jive with the constitutional amendment that we passed a few years ago that says that only voters can expand gaming. There's a lot in this that we can break down if you're really interested, but the short version is, if you're looking at the game tonight, I love the Bucks minus 6.5. So just know that. But otherwise, when this is fully implemented and actually legal in Florida, you'll be the first to know.
I'll give you a little more to know while we move to the next one. But Robert's pretty good at gambling, so listen to him. Essentially is when it was about 4 years ago, they did the No Casinos Pact, did the whole voters in charge. And essentially what it said was you can't expand gaming in the state without voters' approval unless it's through the compact. Okay, so they renegotiated the compact. So on the table games and some of that stuff, that's not in dispute. They're adding craps, they're adding baccarat, some of these other games that you would see in a Vegas casino. But the sports betting part, if it was just in a casino, like if you just went to a Seminole in Tampa or Hollywood, and I think there's one other location, and placed a bet on the Bucks minus 6.5, you'd be fine, and they would be fine on that. But what they did in that is they allowed the pari-mutuels, think of your dog tracks, your highlights, your quarter horse racing tracks. Those groups would now be allowed, if the Seminoles decided to cut a deal with them, to be a part of it. And that's where it got the rub, is because now they're not part of the Seminole Compact, they're not part of the Seminole tribe, and by doing that, have they violated it? Now, the way they think they got around it, and we'll find out as the courts look at it, is you have to have a direct line in. Essentially, like think of your T1 modem, right, that runs through your house or what have you. Like when you place a bet in a pari-mutuel, it's connected straight to a line that runs to the Seminole Tribes Gaming. Personally, I'm hoping they figure out a way to do it because I think it works better if you do it through that hub and spoke model, but the Constitution is the Constitution, and it's hard to get around some of that stuff. So that's going to be what a lot of those arguments go around. And then as well, the Seminoles were allowing for, or at least they say they want to do, gaming through your phone. Like if you've been to New Jersey, I haven't been there and done this, but apparently you can get an app on your phone. It's geofenced, so as long as you're within the boundaries of New Jersey, you can place a bet through one of their state casinos, and that's what they want to do. That one's less problematic. It's the pari-mutuels getting in on the game is going to be the issue. So pay attention to that. It'll be interesting. I think they were supposed to start like this week, if not for the court challenge. So again, Robert's going to have to use an illegal bookie. I hate to say it.
I would never do that.
To do this, but
I would never do that.
All right, let's talk about COVID-19 relief. The one thing last session we knew they were going to do outside of the budget was they were going to do stuff on COVID because obviously there needed to be relief. There needed to be some, as the session goes on, there were other issues that popped up, and some of that was the politics of the day, and we'll go through those. So the liability relief, this one's pretty easy. It was, and you all probably know this by now, it's basically if you're no worse than negligent in following CDC and state guidelines when it comes to COVID in your business or in your operations, you can't be sued. You can, let me back up. Someone can sue you, but the chances of them successfully suing you is almost nil as long as you're no worse than negligent in following that. And you probably heard a lot of that before we came on, so I won't go ad nauseum. Gets interesting, though, when the CDC is saying you got to mask indoors, but the governor says no masking. That's a little tricky. Ask Disney all about that, but otherwise it's fine. Government powers and vaccine passports. So this one is where it got interesting. The conversation started to be had around session of, what if the governor wasn't Ron Desantis? Now, he's not without his critics, and there's probably plenty of critics in this room, but largely speaking, at the time, everyone said the reason Florida's doing so darn well right now as an economy is because this governor said, nope, we're not shutting down the state any further, we're going to open it back up. And so there was this buzz of, well, what if it was Andrew Gillum, right, who he ran against? Or what if it's Nikki Fried, who's going to run against him in the future, and they shut down the state for, 12 months? What would that be? Or what if a local mayor did this or that? And so there was sort of a buzz of, we're going to do something about that. So they essentially passed a law that preempted local governments and the governor from having too much authority in a pandemic type situation, right? For your catastrophic events like a hurricane or flooding and such, the powers would still stay in place both at the local and state level. But there was a real aim to surgically remove some of those powers and say, because the Republicans who love the governor say we got lucky, because if it was any other governor, we'd be terrible. And of course, Democrats have a different opinion, and that's okay, that's politics. But that's kind of where they led with that. Now, here's where it got interesting. In the middle of session, you heard our President Joe Biden say that he thinks maybe we should require vaccine passports everywhere. Well, that's red meat to a Republican base, and the governor did not hesitate to throw it back at him and said, well, not only are we going to say no to the vaccine passports, we're not going to even let our businesses do it or anyone else do it. We're going to ban them out completely, which is the state we live in right now. You cannot require a proof of vaccine if you want to go somewhere. You can't do that hybrid where it's a negative COVID test, or in lieu of that, you can show vaccine proof or confirmation. But that's made for some interesting politics. And it's going to still be litigated. We'll talk about this later in next session. And the last one, vaccine fraud protection. Unfortunately, Florida man does exist, so does Florida woman, and they do horrible things, and they make all the headlines. People were selling, obviously, defected PPE. That probably wasn't a surprise, right? During hurricanes, people sell all kinds of things at way above cost, and sometimes it's not real. Some people were actually trying to sell fake vaccines, which is kind of scary, and maybe that's why there's so much anti-vax in the world. So they obviously passed a law that made it clear that this is absolutely illegal, and the Attorney General has a lot of broad authority to crack down on this if they see this. Hopefully we don't have to deal with that anytime in the future as the pandemic starts to wane off, but we'll see. Next slide. All right, you can go down into the sub one. Some of the business insurance issues. You were going to take those, right? Or I got these. Okay, thank you. Consumer data and privacy. This is the one we talked about. They almost got everything done that they wanted. The leadership had not. This top one got real interesting. So after the elections, it was very popular both in the Democratic and Republican circles to pick on big tech. They passed the bill that talked about, and we'll talk about that as far as tech censorship, about the, taking Trump, if you will, or others off of Facebook, Twitter, and other places. But the other thing they talked about is our privacy, right? This is a very popular topic. It polls very well, even though when you get into the details of it, it's complicated. They wanted to pass a law, I'll just let you know this, at least on the House side, that was going to be more liberal than California. And look, I'm not picking on California. It's a beautiful state, but most laws, if you follow it from California, are pretty far left and liberal and very trial lawyer friendly and tough on business. What came down to with this bill is they wanted to do a lot to protect your data privacy, and some of that's already happening right now. If you notice, if you got your iPhones recently, it says, can I track your data while using this app? That's now, Apple requires that of these users to get, or these apps, to make sure they get consent from you when you're using the app. That's like stuff that's kind of coming on for privacy. But what the state was talking about doing is allowing a private cause of action anytime there's a breach of anyone that has tech data. Now, we think of Facebooks, we think of Twitter, we think of those, but this is Uber. This is a big hotel chain. This is anyone that's dealing in mass quantities of data. So if you're a hospital or other things, you're dealing in lots of data, and people are constantly trying to breach your fortress, right? The big ones pay a lot of dollars. Even the small ones pay a lot of dollars. And so the real rub came down to, should there be a private cause of action if you're breached by some hacker that wants to sell your data back to you? Should everyone in this room now have a private cause of action, go sue that company that got breached? The Senate said no, the governor said no, the House said, nope, we're going to push for that private cause of action. It ultimately failed, and it's going to come back this next session. As a pro-business guy, I tend to fall on the side of, hey, you shouldn't sell the data without permission, but if you get breached and you have a pretty good system, like you shouldn't have John Morgan, God love John Morgan, but shouldn't have John Morgan bringing class action lawsuits against you every time you have a breach, because those will happen. I mean, how many times do you find out your password has been part of a breach, but you don't change it anyways? You're like, it's fine. All right, home-based business, another one. During the pandemic, you might notice a lot of folks were working from home, and a lot of businesses just said, we're just going to do the whole thing from home. Legislature saw fit to say, you know what, we're going to make these laws a little bit easier. Sounds good, really hard to implement, though. And this bill was literally changing until the minute it was passed, and it almost got vetoed just because I think there were some complications. And it's the simple things, right? It's the Airbnb fights you have. When people move into a neighborhood, they don't expect to be moving next to a business, right, where people are coming and going. And what have you. I think everyone's sympathetic and empathetic to the idea of like, hey, maybe that's the only way you can get your business off the ground. And so the legislature put it through. At the end, it was amended pretty significantly where it's not going to have a lot of harm. Before it was you could park as many cars as you want on the street, and then eventually that got carved out. Before it was you could do even industrial, right, as long as there's like not too much of a smell in your backyard, right? That's not good. And before it was like, oh, you could have the T-shirt factory right in the front window next to the dining table. Now it's nothing can be forward-facing to the street. You can't have any smells or sounds or this or that. So basically, if you're running an accounting firm, you could probably do it from home. If you're running anything beyond that, it's going to be tricky. But I think this bill is going to be significant. I think there's going to be a tweak legislation this session because it's just tricky, right? It's like the Airbnb stuff. No one wants to move in next to the party house. It's fun if you're renting it. It's not fun if you live next to it because of all the traffic and coming and going. And got a couple more, yeah.
So Chris mentioned big tech censorship. They did pass a bill on big tech censorship with the removal of people from platforms, creating a basically a mechanism or a boilerplate of steps that have to be taken before somebody can be removed. There was one particular very prominent person who was removed from a prominent platform. You may have heard about it. And that really started not only Florida, but many other red Republican legislatures doing similar things to this. We haven't really seen this tested yet, at least not that I've heard of in any significant way, but it's something to kind of keep an eye on. It was another red meat sort of issue for the Republican legislature to pass pretty early on in session, as they also tried to work on the data privacy, which ultimately didn't get to the finish line. And then alcohol freedom. This was a big win for America, a big win for all of us who love our booze. You may have noticed during the pandemic that cocktails to go became a normal thing. They passed a bill to make that permanent. It was part of an executive order originally. Now you can get your cocktails to go whenever you want. They added more freedom for craft distilleries to be able to sell more stuff in their gift shop, be able to do drinks by the glass. If you've ever been to a craft distillery, you could buy a bottle, but you couldn't buy a drink by the glass. Now you can do that. Cooperative advertising, that's kind of the biggie that's unfinished on the alcohol side. That this would be the one that would allow, hypothetically, SeaWorld to have the Manta roller coaster sponsored by Budweiser. Right now, you can't do that because a retailer can't do business directly with a manufacturer. There has to be a distributor in between, and so that's an issue that will likely come back in next year and years ahead until they get that done, allowing for some cooperative advertising between retailers and manufacturers. But there was a lot of really good stuff on booze this past year.
Growth market and haunted houses, right? I mean, just okay. All right. A few more on the business insurance side, and then we'll kind of move forward. So Pip Repeal, you probably heard a lot of this. We live in the insurance world here, so you're probably paying attention to this. This was one of those last day of session bills that were passed, and I talked about how the governor was in the loop on all of these bills, was signing off on amendments, requesting amendments, and yet it still gets vetoed. This is just tough, right? This is pitting trial lawyers against the insurance companies. It's pitting folks who've had the nightmare situation and saying, the anecdotal of you've got to fix this. This was my terrible situation. So they talked about doing a bunch of different things, and this will probably be back this session, so that's why we included it. Instead of requiring, them to buy PIP, they were going to do it to bodily coverage. Only after fault determination is made, which a lot of folks had problems with because that could take a long time and it can be caught up in court. Ultimately, the governor, and let's call it what it was, right? The big insurance companies came in and used all the leverage they had to say, let's finally put a stop to this and make it a little more friendly to the insurance companies and make bad faith claims a little harder. And they almost got it through. I mean, they did pass the legislature, but ultimately the governor vetoed it. And again, never underestimate the trial bar from a lobbying perspective, right? And I'm sure those of us who've gone up in cases never underestimate them in the courtroom either, but it's a powerful lobby group, and they fight fiercely for their issues. They'll die on the Hill, and they've done a good job. They were in the woods during Jeb Bush's governorship and during the early days of Governor Scott. Like, they had really been pushed to the margins. They were kind of a bad word in the Capitol, but they slowly but surely picked the right candidates, fundraised for them, kind of got some of their own homegrown candidates in there. And now I would say they're not a popular word in the Capitol because it's still a conservative legislature, but they are much more well received. When I go to fundraisers, when Robert goes to fundraisers for various Republican and/or Democratic candidates, you used to not see them at the Republican events. They are now there. They're there visibly with big checks, and they've made their inroads. Hence why they were able to kind of stop this ultimately. And then there's residential property insurance, and this is an interesting one. You probably had folks come knock on your doors and talk about, hey, there was a hailstorm 45 days ago. I'm sure of it. Let's get you a new roof. And then hopefully this hasn't happened to you, but some of the horror stories is they say, let's get you a new roof. It'll all get paid for by insurance. And then once you sign them up and do it, then you find out it's not all going to be paid for by the insurance. The insurance company is going to challenge it. And now you may be suing your contractor or be suing your insurance company, and it gets all sideways. And it's all I hate to pick on them because a lot of them are good actors, but it does appear in many ways to be a big giant scheme or a cottage industry where the lawyers and the contractors are making money and a lot of the consumers are left on the outside looking in on that. So they passed the bill, and he did sign it. We'll see where it ultimately lands because I think this is one of those like whack-a-mole. If you outlaw one bad practice, another bad practice will pop up because at the end of the day, these folks, whether they're good or bad actors, they're still hustling for business. they're going to figure out new ways to hustle for that business, whatever that is.
There are some members in the, and particularly in the Senate, Jeff Brandes comes to mind, who for many years has sort of been a voice crying in the wilderness about the pending property insurance crisis that Florida has. And his criticism of this bill is not that it didn't do anything. He did, I mean, he thought it did something. His criticism was it didn't do enough, that we're not doing enough to address the crisis, and we're not doing enough to address how rates are skyrocketing, and they're only going to continue to skyrocket because of the litigious nature of the state when it comes to these types of claims. So I think you're going to see more and more work done on this in the years ahead. This was a good first step for those that followed it, but more to come.
Right. We'll move. So
that should take us to, if
Yep.
you want me to. So looking ahead to next year, there are a couple things that have to be done next year. One is pass a budget. They have to do it every year. And the second one is redistricting. So we're in the every 10-year session where they have to draw House, Senate, and congressional districts, and that process has begun already. Some of the first congressional maps were released, or proposed congressional maps, I should say, were released earlier this week. There is some rumors out there that the legislature might press pause on the redistricting process and come back in a special session after they finish the regular session to try to knock it out. I think that's a really dangerous idea, personally, because you run the risk of that then the process not being complete before candidate qualifying in June for the August primary. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. Typically they would do it sort of in tandem with the legislative session, but they go back in January. This is part of the agenda, and there's also a few more bills that we know will be back.
Yeah, we mentioned data privacy. That bill is going to come back. The speaker seems pretty intent on bringing it back, and the chamber and AIF groups are fighting against it. The Senate, and speaking with some of the key leadership a couple weeks ago, they don't have an appetite for it, but they know it's coming, and so they're going to do their best. There's a Virginia-style bill that's a little more fair for those of you that deal with a lot of data on that they're going to try to go through it. And Surfside, I would say we all know that tragedy. Tragedies like that don't go without legislation, whether it's knee-jerk or whether it's well thought out. We've already heard some discussions on legislation. I think it's going to trend more towards, they're probably going to pick on condo associations because it's clear that there was some, at least in all the reporting I've read, it's clear that there were some lapses there in ignoring some of the reports. Will it go into inspections or certain buildings having to get certain types of maintenance requirements? We'll see. You've started to see the building code and some of those TAC committees, or the building commission, some of those TAC committees start talking about different maintenance requirements for certain buildings of a certain age and height. There will be something, but I think from the legislators I know that care about this and are going to be tasked with dealing with this, they've all said the following, or pretty consistently, is this appears, the more they look at it, to be a very unique event and not like a crisis across the state, not something they're concerned about happening again and again, but this was like the perfect storm of location, of ignoring the maintenance issues, of the age of the building, et cetera, and so they're trying their best not to overreact, but there will be some legislation that comes out on that. We've got plenty of clients that deal in the development world and the construction world that they will obviously be paying attention to this, because depending on what you do, you increase the cost to get that building or to maintain that building, and some may be unnecessarily so. You want to talk about revenge legislation, or you want me to jump on that one?
I'll let you take that one.
Okay. So we talked about the vaccine passports and what have you. I would say it is a safe assumption or statement to say that the governor and certainly folks in the legislature are frustrated with certain governments across the state. We're in one of them, Orange County, where there's Mayor Demings and his team saw fit that they wanted to require vaccines for all their employees. That did not go over well with the governor and some of the legislators, and that's going to be battled. We talked about the vaccine passport. As you probably know, as private employers, you can require the vaccine in your business of your employees. That is not restricted in state law, certainly not federal law, where the president is saying everyone should get it. There's a wrinkle in the vaccine passport ban of, do local governments that can't require a vaccine to enter their premises, can they require it of their employees? The governor's team would say no. There's others that I trust with their legal acumen that say yes, they can. I'm sure that will get litigated at some point. Gainesville did it as well, but they've pulled back. Orange County's holding strong. I promise you there'll be, I think they already Keith Perry filed some legislation similar. There's going to be a lot of legislation on that. I think you'll see some legislation around how they deal with venues, right? So Harry Styles, anyone a big Harry Styles fan? If you have young daughters, you probably know who I'm talking about. he was in Orlando last week, and they had a concert, and so he wanted everyone to be vaccinated, but in Florida, you can't require proof. So what they ultimately did was they said, you have to show proof of a negative test within 48 hours, and they had some testing there on site. You could do the rapid test, or proof of vaccination. And that has become sort of an industry standard, right, of like, well, we can't require these vaccine cards, but we know no one really wants to constantly be getting tests, so we'll say, instead of a test, you can do this. I've heard there'll be legislation that they may get rid of that, right? And say that, nope, you can't do that at all. You can't just at all invoke the vaccine confirmation or what have you, which we'll see where that plays out. But I think there's going to be, and the school boards, let's not forget them, the mask, no mask mandates, what have you. We see what's happening, that every time the state imposes a fine, President Biden and his team gives them the money to make up for the fine, and then the state imposes more fines. I think you can know where this is going. I bet there'll be more money sent down to Orange County, and some of the other schools require masks until whatever. There will be a law passed on this. That one I can almost guarantee, because this is, right or wrong, the governor is clearly focused on it, and a lot of the legislators are focused on it as well. I don't know where they land on it, and it's certainly being challenged in court, but there's going to be a lot of, I call it revenge legislation, where the laws they passed last year probably weren't the best drawn, and it was done quickly, and they see the gaps in it now that folks have been able to drive through for what they need to do with their local community, and I think the legislature is going to think long and hard of how to tie all those loopholes up and make it very clear that no one's allowed to do anything unless the governor or the legislature says so. And then, what was the last one? Oh, redistricting.
So we mentioned redistricting. The other one worth noting is a Texas-style abortion bill. There's already been some filed in Florida. One in particular in the House got a lot of attention. That's not going to, if you read about that, that's not going to be the bill that the House or the Senate ultimately moves forward with. Chances are that's going to come as a committee bill, probably out of the House Judiciary Committee and maybe out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. But it's something to keep an eye on as well, because no matter how you feel about that issue, and everybody has very firm thoughts on that issue, it does take up, whenever the legislature decides to take up a bill like abortion, it's going to take up a lot of time. And so committee time, floor time, there will be ample debate. Tons of hand-wringing and gnashing of teeth over a bill like that on both sides, which ultimately means that a lot of other stuff gets pushed to the side as they deal with a high-profile social issue such as that. And so with that, we sort of started by saying we're not sure what they're going to work on next year. There's not a whole lot to do. There is some stuff that we are aware of, but that's sort of our quick run through things, and we'd love to answer any questions that y'all have got or get you off ready for your 1920s gambling party, so whichever you prefer.
I think we have a few minutes for questions, and happy to take a few on if you guys have any.
This past session, being it remote, you guys did a good job describing that. With the record number of low bills that got passed or laws that got passed, I mean, did that just mean it was because the number of proposed ones that got through? Does that mean it's worse than all of us in our time up there? So take last year we were up there. Was this past one worse?
So the question was, as you think about the last legislative session and the number of bills that passed, tell me if I'm paraphrasing this right, are we wasting our time? Is that kind of the idea? Is there a way to get them to do more? Is that kind of the thought?
Kind of saying,
Yeah.
is this year a year to take something on
Yeah.
versus just save your money, head for the hills?
Yeah.
And take it again next
No, it's a great question, and what I would point back to on that slide, I may have done a poor job of explaining it. That the 275 bills that passed is actually the most that they've passed in any legislative session in the last 10 years. I think it's 8 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Usually it's about 210, 220 bills that they're passing out of the 3,000 that are passed. I would argue that they passed more this year because the building was empty. Because they didn't have people like us or groups like y'all having their day at the Capitol and being forced to answer to some of the things they were doing. Data privacy is a great example. I think in a normal legislative session, that bill doesn't get off the ground nearly as quickly, or certainly not as far as it did this past legislative session, because the House and the Senate didn't have a hallway full of lobbyists knocking on their door saying, this is crazy, you're worse than California, how can we pass something worse than California? And they didn't have that, right? They were sort of in their own little echo chamber, for lack of a better example. And so I think there are some things that probably got further down the field or even got to passage that wouldn't have in a normal year. And as we look ahead to next year, I think given the the limited number of priorities that are still out there for the presiding officers and for the governor, other than some of the ones we've talked about, I think it does create opportunity for other ideas to maybe matriculate to the top that would have otherwise been tamped down by the pressure of the other issues. That's just sort of my initial thought.
Yeah, it's clear that the high number of bills in comparison to previous years, I think, is a direct result of people not being in the Capitol, and folks like y'all and folks like Robert and I, who would have otherwise, I call it the VP of Common Sense, would have said, "Are you sure you want to pass that?" Like, you know, because people talk in the Capitol, you go through the halls, you see them at the bars and the restaurants, and you hear the legislation, and these members, they react. They're human like the rest of us, right? And they hear from you, and they hear your reaction to certain pieces, and they see folks back home, right? I mean, because when these folks were going back home, they weren't doing a lot of public appearances either. They were just going home, seeing the wife and kids or what have you, and then come back up to Tallahassee. So it was a quiet session in that regard, and they weren't hearing from a lot of folks except for, you know, the text here, the Zoom call there. And as a result, like, the leadership in both chambers had a lot more power than probably ever before, because you know, when you're not interacting with each other, and they weren't doing a lot of that, and you weren't interacting with us, what the leadership was saying was taking hold right away. So that, hence what Robert said at the start, all but one issue got passed last session that was a priority of both the leaders and the governor, and I don't think that was on accident. This session, I think you'll see, we were up there this week. It's still kind of quiet. I was meeting with Senator Stargell on the Senate side, and she goes, "I can't believe this committee." I mean, because literally I'm walking the halls and kind of reacquainting where the offices are, because we weren't allowed in there last year in the Senate, and just not a lot of people were up there. I think they're still getting used to how this session's going to go, and members are also more comfortable with Zoom meetings than they were before. Like, half my meetings now are still Zoom. Like, I'll have a member say, "Well, I'm not available Wednesday, but I have some Zoom time on Monday morning while I'm back in district. You just want to do it that way?" And I'm, "Sure, why not?" I mean, we know them well enough that's effective for us. So it's changing a little bit of the way how they do lobbying. You're going to see members now leave town quicker, I think, because they know that they could just go back home and either Thursday afternoon or Friday do a bunch of Zoom calls to make up with some of with us, as opposed to waiting to leave because they've got an army of lobbyists that still need to meet with them, what have you. But it'll be interesting. Yep. Yeah.
So the question is the future leaders for the next couple of years. So the two most prominent are Paul Renner, who is the incoming House Speaker. Paul's from Palm Coast, St. Augustine area is kind of his district. And he is actually, a quick story about Paul, he was first elected to a seat in Jacksonville. First ran for a seat in Jacksonville and was beaten in a primary by a guy named Jay Fant. And if you're from Jacksonville, you may know that name. And it was like a 50-vote margin. It was some tiny
3-vote margin.
There you go, 3-vote margin
Yeah.
in the primary. And had he won that race, he would have never been Speaker, because he would have fallen into the Chris Sprouse class, and therefore wouldn't have been Speaker designate. He moved back to a little bit further south. There was a special election because Travis Hudson left the House and ran for the Senate. And that was all around the time that John Thrasher was becoming the president of FSU. There was a whole lot of dominoes that sort of fell, and that created the opportunity for Paul to run again in a special election. And as a result, he got a head start on his class and became the House Speaker. So Paul's a lawyer by trade, served in the armed forces prior to that, and he'll be a great leader for the Florida House. And then Kathleen Pasadomo is a real estate transactional lawyer from Naples, and she's taking over for the Senate. And both of those will happen right at the election in November of 22. So the way the House and the Senate work, they have a formal swearing in when they come to Tallahassee for organizational session, but for all intents and purposes, you become a member on the night of the election. And so they will become the presiding officers on the night of whatever that Tuesday is in November.
Sure. Yeah. So questions and indications past that. Well, the joke is in the House of Representatives that they select the speakers when they're born because they're picked so far out. But it's only half kidding on that. But so they have picked through all the classes that are currently out there. Danny Perez out of Miami, Florida. He's going to be the speaker following Paul Renner. So that would be 2024 when he would, assuming the Republicans remain control. And then beyond that, yes, they've even selected the class after that. Sam Garrison, who's out of Clay County area in Florida, he's going to be in the class for 2026. And while they're not elected yet, we already know of at least 3, maybe even 4 candidates that are now trying to run this next election cycle to get elected in the House that are already trying to angle within the folks that they think are going to win to be Speaker. Just think about that. Now in the Senate, and I promise you there's people who are already thinking beyond that, so 2030 or 2020, 2028. In the Senate, Robert mentioned Kathleen Pasadomo. And beyond that, it's not 100% official, but it would seem to be very clear that Ben Albritton out of Wauchula, Florida area, he is likely to be the Senate president following Kathleen Pasadomo. And when I say it's not official, the Senate, they never quite come out and say it. Like, for the longest time, it was the worst kept secret that Kathleen Pasadomo was going to be the Senate president following Wilton Simpson, but yet there was no even kind of acknowledgement of it. And then just miraculously, she started showing up on fundraiser invites as Wilton Simpson, Kathleen Pasadomo, which was a clear indication where they are in the leadership. Now you're starting to see Ben Albritton's name added to I guess the marquee. So Wilton Simpson, Kathleen Pasadomo, you see Ben Albritton thrown in there, although nothing official. He was running against Manny Diaz out of Miami. I don't know if Manny has officially conceded. Maybe he has, but I haven't heard that, so maybe that's why there's still some, maybe it's not official. Beyond that, there's a couple folks that are trying to be the Senate president following Ben, assuming Ben Albritton, but that hasn't sorted
Yeah, and of course the
itself out.
Senate's got a much closer Republican to Democrat split, right? In a 40-member body, it only takes a couple of seats to flip, and you could lose control pretty quickly. So, like in 2020, there was some thought that they went into that election 23-17, and there was some thought that the Democrats were going to pick up at least 2, if not 3 seats, and if they had gotten all 3, it would have been a 2020 Senate, which would have been fascinating to be a part of. Instead, the Republicans actually picked up a seat. Now it's 24-16. But looking ahead to 2022, there's a few seats the Republicans have to defend around the state, so you could see Democrat pickups and all of that. You know, like with any election, national stuff matriculates its way down to impact even state elections.
Oh, think Polk County area, Highland County area. Yeah, and the question was, where's Wauchula for
Citrus
the
country.
folks? So the only other thing I would tell you is the other wrinkle on that is redistricting. So in the House, they have 8 years. Doesn't matter what they do with redistricting. You're going to have 8 years at the most that you can serve based on term limits. In the Senate, there is a wrinkle where you could get 10 years, and that is when you run for office, you can't. You will have not completed your 8th year. So if you get it, so say you've already done 6 years, and so you haven't done a full 8, and they redistrict it, and you get a 4-year seat, and they're all on the ballot because of redistricting. So come and get your checkbooks out for those who play the political game. All senators are going to be on the ballot this go round in 2022, whereas usually only 20 and then another 20 the next cycle. If you get a 4-year seat and you've already served 6 years, you're technically getting 10 years in the Senate. Or if you're a brand new senator that's maybe finishing a 2-year term and you get a 4-year seat, then you would have 10 years if you wanted to finish out because you get two more 4-year terms. That's relevant in that class that's trying to run to replace or to follow Ben is that if one of them gets 8 years, like so to speak, like maybe they get a 2-year seat to go with the 2-year seat that they've had just now, and that means they only got a 4-year seat after that. They only get 8 years. But if they get a 4-year seat and they get 10 years, they could in theory wait a turn and be the speaker or the president after that person in that class. So there's some politics that go into play a little bit in that. And the Senate just generally, because it's so fluid like that, and you sometimes have those 10-year tracks, they don't finalize who's going to be who until a little closer.
And the way they decide that, by the way, the 2 and the 4-year seats, is purely random. It's literally balls in a machine, picking them to see who gets the 2-year seats and who gets the 4-year seats. It's quite interesting to watch.
Because gaming's legal in Florida.
That's right.
Other questions we may be able to answer for you. We are like between y'all and a bar, so I get it. And Roberts fights for that freedom for you to get to that bar, so we should get y'all there. Well, I give you guys 5 more seconds to come up with a question if you have one. I think I can speak for Robert. It's a true honor to work with y'all, and we love coming to this conference. But it's a lot of fun, and it's a true honor to represent y'all up in Tallahassee and the issues that you have, and because you guys got a great thing going here. Every time when I talk to Shane or Asib or the team and find out the new members and all the savings that they're able to provide for y'all as you guys pull together, it's just amazing. And we love whenever we see David Altmeyer, the insurance commissioner, and others, we love bragging on it because you guys got something special going on here, and are able to pass on some savings that otherwise you wouldn't get in the open market without this group. So we're glad to be on your team.
Well said. No, thank you so much.